and welcome to another episode of The Conversation. The show is here to stimulate wide and diverse discussions on the many topics that are of national importance. To this end, we are offering this platform to have the conversation. I am your host, Carla Barnett. For years, private sector groups, later joined by the trade unions, were advocating for the government to sign on to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, UNCAC. Recently, Unkak is in the headlines again as the unions demand that government implement it. We were curious to find out if Belizeans knew what Unkak was, so we took to the streets and asked them. Take a look.
Do you know what Unkak is?
Yes, I do.
No, never heard of it.
No.
No.
Sorry, I'm not familiar with the term.
Yes, I know because I read about it and I have friends and staff and employer tell me about it.
No.
Somewhat, I would say yes.
In your own words, what is Unkak?
It's, a legislation that would hold ministers, public servants, anybody accountable if they're breaking the law in that manner. And they will could be taken to the courts, and actually be charged and held accountable for what they're doing.
UNCAC means how Belizean people are living and how we are living in a crisis time and we are living in a crime, and people don't believe we don't need crime, we need peace and love.
I would say it's international standards and protocols set by the United Nations for all of the countries to abide against, corruption and that type of stuff.
What effect do you think it will have if fully implemented in Belize?
If fully implemented in Belize, I believe that it will have a positive change, because now ministers will be aware that the things that they're doing, that they will have laws now set in place that will take them to court and they can be charged for whatever they are doing. So I believe that it will change, and the same things that what everybody is fighting for right now, for people to be held accountable for the things that they're doing. And Belizeans' assets and monies are not just going by the wayside and nobody's being charged for what is happening.
I would say Belize would have good favors with the UN, and also it will put us on good standards.
Well, there you have it. Most of those polled had no clue about UNCAC or only had a general understanding of how politicians especially would be impacted. So before we get into our conversation with our guests for tonight, I thought that it would be useful for me to provide some basic information on UNCAC and clear up some confusion. What is UNCAC? UNCAC is the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Has Belize signed UNCAC? Yes, in December of 2016. Has Belize ratified the convention? There is no need to ratify because the convention was already in force internationally. So Belize got the Senate to approve accession. We acceded to the convention. This means that what was signed was an instrument of accession, not an instrument of ratification. On signature, Belize became a state party to the convention. Belize acceded to the United Nations Convention on the 12th of December 2016. The convention has not been entered into force as a consequence of Belize being a country that has the dualist system in international law. In effect, the convention now has to be incorporated into our domestic or municipal law to be given full force and effect. Full implementation will be completed at the end of the implementation review process. This is from the report, the Belize Final Country Report that was concluded last year. What are the objectives of the convention? A, to promote and strengthen measures to prevent and combat corruption more efficiently and effectively. B, to promote, facilitate, and support international cooperation and technical assistance in the prevention of and fight against corruption, including asset recovery. C, to promote integrity, accountability, and proper management of public affairs and public property. I hope this information is helpful for the conversation that is about to take place. Joining me in the studio tonight for this very important, timely discussion is Darrell Bradley, attorney at law, former mayor of Belize City, and a strong advocate for good governance. Good evening and welcome, Darrell.
Good evening, Dr. Barnett. It's surely a pleasure to be here on the conversation.
It is great to have you. And joining us virtually are two executives from the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Marissa Longsworth is an attorney at law and president of the Belize Chamber of Commerce, and Giacomo Sanchez is a certified public accountant and treasurer of the Chamber. Welcome, Marissa. Welcome, Giacomo.
Thank you, Dr. Barnett. Thank you.
Great to have you. Is Giacomo online?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, great to have you too. There are a number of issues that have arisen as we work towards the signing of UNCAC in 2016 and even now in the public discourse. One is there a magic bullet with UNCAC when it comes to fighting corruption? Does it mean that once you sign and implement that corruption disappears? That's the first question, because in the lead up to the signing, there were people who thought that the UN would swoop in and clean everything up, and it doesn't work like that.
Yeah, so one of the things that you mentioned in one of the earlier slides is that Belize follows a dualist approach in relation to international law. Essentially what that means is that when our country signs on to an international treaty, it is really signing on to the treaty to say that as a country we become a state party.
Right.
But it is only domestic law which is binding within Belize. That's an international treaty.
Right.
So there has to be a process where that international treaty is translated, incorporated, and brought into domestic law by various pieces of local legislation. So that the signing of an international treaty is really symbolic. It is that your country is signing on to these international principles and aspirations, but there has to be a process which is very lengthy. There has to be a process of implementation where there's a series of legislation that brings that treaty into force within domestic law.
Right. And in the case of UNCAC, we would have already on our books some of the laws that we are required to have, particularly since we have been party to the Inter-American Convention as well, which requires the same set of laws to be put into place. Is UNCAC only for government to implement?
Well, I'd open it up. I don't want to dominate the conversation, but one of the things, if you notice the convention itself, it speaks about the involvement of private sector, and it talks about the accountability on private sector itself. That's Article 12 of the convention, so that a government official doesn't bribe himself. There's a relationship between the movement of money and assets and influence peddling and so forth between the public and the private sector, so that when you talk about asset recovery, I mean, we were in public life. We're not paying ourselves if there's any kind of untoward kind of behavior. So UNCAC really is a national agenda, and it takes into account both the private sector and it takes into account civil society as well. So there's a section that deals with the involvement and encouragement of civil society in terms of ensuring that it is brought into full force.
Absolutely. The unions are saying, and we've been hearing a lot of that discussion recently, the unions are saying that whistleblowing legislation, waste, misappropriation of public expenditure, and misuse of public assets are the priorities for them. What would be the top priorities for the private sector? Can I ask Marissa, what would be the priorities for the private sector in the implementation of UNCAC?
Well, it's a bit difficult in terms of coming up with the exact order in which we would like things to occur. There are so many measures in the UNCAC that are necessary to piece together the puzzle needed to create an ecosystem that effectively fights corruption. In fact, when you look at the so-called checklist of key actions for the implementation of UNCAC, there are several measures which are considered mandatory measures for any state party that has signed on to the convention itself. There are a few others which are called your shall endeavor provisions. And so there, you know, what the private sector has really been consistently harking on has to do with, first of all, the effective body or bodies to prevent corruption, such as the Integrity Commission, such as the strengthening of the Contractor General's office, such as the strengthening of the Public Accounts Committee, the insulation of the judiciary and the DPP from political interference or appointment. Those are things that we have consistently been speaking about and which fall within the Unkak mandatory measures. We also have spoken about effective public procurement, trying to centralize how we award contracts, how we pay out of the public purse for goods and services. And so those are very important to the private sector as well. You did mention, of course, that the private sector has a role to play in Unkak, and that's very correct. We realize that that is a point as well. The Unkak speaks about rules of conduct and encouraging auditing and proper accounting of finances in the private sector, which could lead, of course, to evidence of bribery within the public sector for the gain of private companies.
That's really important, Marisa, because I always tell people government officials don't bribe themselves. There are two hands have to wash, so the private sector and the public sector have to be very, very much working together to ensure that that particular issue is dealt with.
Yeah. One of the things that I will add in terms of, I've engaged with the private sector on some of these discussions, and I think it's very important because when you look at the earlier parts of the convention where, before it gets into the criminalization of certain activities and conduct, one of the important things that they mentioned there is a merit-based public service. It's actually an important part that comes in the earlier section of the convention. And people kind of talk about Unkak, anti-corruption. And one of the discussion points that I generally raise is that when you talk about anti-corruption, it's actually very negative. Like you're talking about like a lash one politician or something like that. And people kind of like, everybody wants to beat up on the politician. But the idea is really to encourage more efficient and effective public services. That's a big part of Unkak. I mean, Dr. Barnett, you've worked internationally and you're really talking about human development and you're talking about the public service as being the vehicle for human development. And one of the things I know that the Chamber of Commerce always talks about is the level of efficiencies in public services. How long does it take you to get your land document back? Basic public services in terms of housing, education, healthcare. So one of the things why this is very important to the average person is that the average person may not realize the cost of corruption to GDP and the cost of corruption to the overall advancement of Belize. There have been studies internationally that has looked at countries in Africa, in Asia, even more advanced countries and countries in the Caribbean to look at the impact of GDP growth on corruption itself. And that's a big thing. So that when you look at it, I think that every Belizean should be interested in it because we're really talking about public services, and every money that is misspent or wasted is a dollar that could have gone into scholarships or public housing or some public service that could have benefited the country.
Absolutely. And there are, in fact, if you go on the International Financial Institutions websites, studies that actually work out and they actually do estimates of the impact, the negative impact of corrupt activities, corruption on the GDP, on a country's ability to fight the crime, the ability to fight poverty and all of that. Can I ask you, Daryl, what would be your main priorities for Unkak? What are the things that you would like to see us put at the top of the agenda?
Well, I agree in part with what Marissa was talking about, because I think one of the big aspects is we do have some good legislation on the books. For example, there is the Prevention of Corruption in Public Life Act. There is various other pieces of legislation, but enforcement is a big issue. And Marissa mentioned this in relation to ensuring that the institutions that are supposed to champion corruption and anti-corruption are well-funded and independent, so that you're dealing with your Auditor General's office, your Integrity Commission, for example, when you're doing your filings, who actually checks and ensures that there are people who don't file, they're prosecuted. And if you are doing filings which cannot be justified by your income, that there's actually an enforcement mechanism, there's investigation. I think since the independence of Belize, I do not know of any public official in terms of high office who has been successfully prosecuted for any kind of corruption-related activity. And that should be something that we need to introspect on. So I think a big part of this is enforcement mechanisms, giving the legislation that we have on the books teeth so that it's effective.
It's a little bit more than that. Marissa talked about an ecosystem. The ecosystem will include as well training for ordinary persons, training for judicial persons, training for prosecutorial, so all of that kind of training and capacity building is a part of ensuring proper implementation. How important is UNCAC for Belize's governance?
I think it's tremendously important. I think as a developing country, especially in times like these in terms of COVID, every dollar counts.
Absolutely.
You can do trackings, and I've actually done this on a little bit of a pencil and paper in relation to, I mean, you're talking about the unions, you're talking about a pay cut. Significant savings can be gathered from the more efficient and effective spending of public funds, so that the unions are talking about things like efficient taxation. They're talking about cutting government spending in terms of certain particular areas. And they're talking about these measures in relation to making government more efficient and effective. And I think that it's hugely important. I think that anti-corruption is Belize's biggest developmental challenge. Like I would actually put my head on the block and say that that is number one there. And I think that
you would probably have an argument with some of the conservationists.
Oh, no. I mean, I think that because it even affects conservation issues. Because you want those systems to be transparent, and you want those systems to be...
Absolutely.
Here,
we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we will make sure that we bring Marissa and Giacomo into the conversation a little bit more. So we'll take a short break. Good night and welcome back to the conversation. I am your host, Carla Barnett. Tonight we are discussing UNCAC, what it is and how it can be implemented. There are a lot of issues that can be considered in the Belize context, and the report that was prepared by the group, the two countries that did our assessment, has made a lot of recommendations on what we should be prioritizing in Belize. And I should remind everyone that this process of assessment is built into the UNCAC mechanism. When you sign on, you become part of that mechanism for assessment of where you are, and they draw lots, and countries select experts who come and review our state of affairs. And so when the experts came and they met with everyone that they needed to meet with, they then went back and they produced this report that lay out the status of our implementation of UNCAC. And if anybody wants that report, I've been telling everybody, all you do, you go online, you Google UNCAC, country review report, Belize, and it will take you directly to it. That's how efficient the internet is with this. And among the recommendations that were made, we're going to select a few that we believe are quite pertinent to Belize. And I'd want to ask Marissa, and Giacomo, and Daryl, of course, to weigh in on these. The first recommendation, should we criminalize trading in influence as recommended by the report? What is trading in influence, Marissa? What would that be like?
Well, trading in influence is really one of what I find to be one of the interesting aspects of corruption that's discussed. Often when we think about corruption, we think about the actual exchange of money from one hand to the other, but we don't think about the fact that someone who has a certain amount of influence for decisions that can benefit someone else may trade or use that influence to have undue advantage. So let's say, for example, I am the chairman of a board that makes huge decisions relating to some big projects. I may say to that person, well, you know, as chairman, I have the casting vote. And so if you promise me that I will get a job in your corporation when I retire in 5 years, I will ensure to use my casting vote to give you this result that you're looking for.
So there's no money effectively moving, but you know that there's mutual gain.
And I have used my influence, so I have used that as my trading tool in that situation. So that is actually something that we may come across more often than not when we speak about corruption. Sometimes there's no passing of money, but there is a mutual agreement that I can do something for you that will result in a benefit to you if you return to me something else, possibly immaterial, intangible. And actually that's a recommendation that came out of one of our country reviews, that our laws need to go a little bit further and look at the immaterial benefits, the things that you might not be able to track funds for, but there is an obvious result that has come from some action happening between two people.
What about bribery? Is the criminal code adequate where that is concerned?
What I have seen from the recommendations is that we have a decent definition of active bribery under the criminal code. One of the recommendations that I see, however, is that there needs to be a harmonizing of offenses under the criminal code for bribery with the offense of active bribery under the Proceeds of
Prevention of Corruption Act.
The Prevention of Corruption Act, so that they both include the elements of promising, offering, and giving. And also there is a need to harmonize the definition of public official, because of course you want all of your acts, if you have one event happening as it relates to bribery, you want to have all of your legislation harmonized and in line with one another, so that they can work together to try to ensure that you cease this behavior once and for all, with adequate punishment for whatever it is that has occurred.
Right. And not to leave out Giacomo, are the existing sanctions for corruption-related offenses, do you think they are effective? Are they dissuasive? Are they strong enough to dissuade persons from becoming involved in corrupt activities? Should we consider increasing maximum fines? Those kinds of things. Have you considered those issues?
Yes, we have. And when you look at the review coming out of the assessment that was done for Belize, I think we felt we were falling short of that. And definitely we could use, I believe if the sanctions were a bit more punitive, I think that is where we'd see significant improvements.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes,
One of the
Sarah?
things that I wanted to contribute in relation to what Marissa was mentioning is, when you look at things like trading in influence, and when you look at more passive types of corrupt activities, one of the things that people have to realize is it's very difficult to prove. There's an element of investigation, and this is why it always goes back to how strong are your investigation
capabilities. Right.
I know that the FIU is doing a tremendous amount of work to upgrade their capabilities. I know that there was increased funding that has been lobbied for the Integrity Commission.
Right.
But many of these agencies are not staffed with forensic auditors. They're not staffed. So one of the difficulties is that you can have very effective laws, but if the institutions are not there that are capable of enforcing these laws, because I think we do have fairly decent laws. The country report says that we need to go far more, but we do have some laws on the books which criminalize some of these activities, but we've never had a successful prosecution. And I think in tandem with upgrading the laws, we need to ensure that the institutions and the mechanisms for enforcement are there. Otherwise, you will not be able to make a successful prosecution. One other thing that I wanted to also add is this issue that I think the convention doesn't really focus on a lot, because wider than this, all this definition, this whole discussion is the issue of public ethics.
Right.
And I always heard that this thing, good men make good laws, but good laws can't make good men.
Right.
And so you may have perfect legislation, but really we have to take the conversation further than that to talk about questions of leadership, to talk about questions of public performance, and to look, you mentioned, Doc, in terms of training and all of those things, because part of it has to do with, regardless of how much of a good system you will have, really we are the ones who will police it.
Who will
so
implement,
we have
make
to,
sure that it's implemented.
Like when you look at like ethics committees in terms of the public institutions and codes of conduct, training, I think a lot of people, I remember even when I was mayor and I was a senator, you're doing things that you yourself may be not conscious that it's actually a violation of ethics codes. Like, who do you have lunch with?
Right.
Who do you, like, so all of those, you don't even think about those things, but part of it is training and public awareness so that we could implement the spirit as well as the letter of the law.
Do you have anything you'd like to add to that, Marissa or Giacomo? Because it's really important,
yes,
the issue that Darrell put on the table about public, what is acceptable in terms of ethical behavior.
Okay, let's. I think this is a good point where I can take us back to the first question you had, and do a comparison with my day job, and I think it will help the public understand. For private in the private sector, you have companies, and within those companies, they have internal audit departments, they have control processes, they have all sorts of ethics committees, and so the private sector is managing its own, it's monitoring itself, and think of those small corporations compared to the government, and think of the government now as a huge corporation that there's a whole host of legislation that is not sufficiently capable of managing the effects of corruption. As a result, your original question had to do with what is private sector and civil society contribution. Well, as Darrell said, we could make the perfect laws, but we won't get perfect results coming out of that unless there. And here's where I'm going at. If we, as we go along implementing the Unkak, and the laws are such a way that it favors the government, the politician, what have you, then it becomes meaningless. With the legislation has to contain some elements that is triggered from outside, where private sector, civil society can trigger certain mechanisms that then forces the legislation to work.
Okay.
Unless we have that, I don't think that it
So
will be a long.
you're speaking to greater involvement of civil society in the process of implementation.
Of course. Well, it's not only implementation, but it's post-implementation likewise, because it is. Remember, at the end of the day, we're looking at and managing and ensuring that the public purse is spent in a fundamentally in a reasonable way.
Right.
And if there's no, if only government or the public service is overseeing that, they can monitor themselves, and that is where I mean, intrinsically, you have we're civil society, and
Right.
the private sector plays a vital role in terms of ensuring that the government complies as we go along.
With the requirements of the law, right,
And
right.
those requirements have to be extremely clear as well. Just to add here that I've had experiences in the past in former jobs where what I would help to do is give the Christmas tokens to partners of the agency with which I was working. And for some of the international agencies, if the value of the gift was over $25 US, they cannot accept it. They would send it back to you because it was known from the smallest in quotations person in the organization that is their limit in terms of gifts, no matter what the intention of the gift was. I don't know that we have that amount of clarity in our own systems here.
No, we don't. And I remember many years ago when I was working at a particular institution for a short time, and when Christmas came, there was a delivery of boxes of liquor. And my thing to the head honcho in charge was, but we're not supposed to accept this, are we? But unless there are rules and regulations at the enterprise level and across government, then we're going to have to, deal with that all the time.
Well, Marissa mentioned a good point, because I remember even when I was at City Hall as mayor, we used to have mayors who visited, and I used to always recall that when they came from certain countries, if you even would give them the key to the city, or you would give them maybe like some token, you had to give them the receipt with the gift as well, because they needed to show how much that gift cost. And that used to always set me back. But this goes again in terms of having, and I like this conversation here, having meaningful conversations about what this actually means in principle, and like digging into it. And I think that if we would sit down as a country, because this is something that can really unify Belizeans, because it is something that is important not only for the efficiency of government, but for every citizen, private sector, civil society, churches, and the average person on the street. If we could put together a list, because this is very voluminous. If you, countries will take maybe 20, 30 years to implement this. But if you would sit down with government and civil society and the private sector, and you would agree to perhaps maybe like 6 core pieces of legislation. One of the things, I agree with everything that Marissa mentioned, but one of the things that I would add to that is the importance of campaign finance. I think that that's a huge
campaign
issue.
finance reform.
Yes,
you need legislation that monitors the amount of monies, because again, you're dealing with influence peddling. You need legislation that monitors and requires the reporting of monies that politicians collect, political parties collect, and campaign agents collect. I think actually that's a big issue in there, because if somebody is giving me $50,000, $100,000, $500,000, clearly if you're talking about influence, that person will have a lot of influence. You need to know who that person is, and you need to have checks and balances as to how that system works. And there are a lot of other pieces, but I would think that if we as a society would sit down and agree to 5 or 6 key pieces of legislation, you could get that done relatively quickly. There is a lot of model legislation about this, so this is not rocket science.
And we already have some of the legislation in place, so it is to strengthen where those bits of legislation may need to be strengthened. There are several other areas that have been identified in the report that I'd just like to note. Do we need better asset recovery legislation? That's one of the things we have to consider. Should we be seeking to reduce the monetary threshold that is used to define advantage under the Proceeds of Crime Act? Because if it's $10, it's different from if it's $10,000, and therefore it has to be realistic and meaningful. Do we need, and this is one that's interesting, and we have to give consideration to it. Do we need longer than normal statute of limitations periods? under the Proceeds of Crime Act that goes well beyond when public officials leave office. Yeah. So that if you the statute of limitations for a criminal act is defined in the law. So do we need to institute longer statutes of limitations for that? And so these are the kinds of things that we would want to see, some discussion among the private sector, labor, government, to see where the priorities should lie. I don't know if you have any views on any of those particular bits of legislation, Marisa.
Well, there are the recommendations coming out. One of the country reports was in fact in line with many that you mentioned, that we need a longer statute of limitations period under the Prevention of Corruption Act, or change its starting date to the date that the facts giving rise to such offense came to the knowledge of the DPP or the FIU, and provide in the Prevention of Corruption Act and the Anti-Money Laundering Act for its suspension where the alleged offender has evaded the administration of justice.
Right.
So we know that a big issue is that you will have someone who knows they're on the radar and they will disappear and evade justice as long as they can.
Right.
How disastrous would it be if they're able to hide for 6 years, 10 years, and then able to walk the streets because of a technicality that says that the statute of limitations has run out on them.
Or if they go to another country, so do we need better extradition laws? Because our extradition laws are also identified as being quite weak.
Right, and the mutual legal assistance as well.
Right.
I think
if you notice in the country report, the issue of extradition treaty has been emphasized because under the chapter of international cooperation, that is extremely important, whereby people tend to move across borders and seek immunity.
Right.
And I think that feature of the convention really tries to clamp down on that type of activity.
Yeah. One of the things that I will add in here is that if you look at the convention itself, it talks also about a foreign sponsor. So it recognizes that corruption and influence peddling and bribery, especially for developing countries, in many cases may come from foreign financiers.
Right.
So that it is recognized that it requires international cooperation, because we need to have, say for example, somebody in Canada bribes a politician in Belize, they need to have effective mechanisms in Canada.
On both sides.
On both sides also, enforcement and so forth, so that we can hold everybody accountable in relation to that specific transaction.
What about asset recovery? What do we need to do there? Any ideas about that, Giacomo?
It's literally for us to get that. We need to build it from the ground up, because I don't know that we have anything sufficiently decent enough on our books to complement that at this time. So that is something essentially new that will be coming.
That would be new to us indeed, and some of the issues that we've been talking about recently relate directly to that. Let's take a pin on this discussion and take a short commercial break. Thank you for staying tuned into the conversation. I am Carla Barnett. We have been discussing what Unkak is and how the convention can be incorporated into domestic laws to bring it into full force. And so we need to talk about how we do that. What do you believe, let me ask Giacomo, what do you believe should be the next step in the process of bringing Unkak into force?
Well, the next step is, remember, based on the country review, all we did essentially was initially to do our gap assessment.
A gap analysis, yes.
Our gap analysis, and thereafter the country review occurred. Now, they have pointed to certain strengthening of our legislation, which we haven't even touched. And so that process has to continue. under the criminalization law enforcement, and also under the international cooperation.
Right.
And then there's two other areas of the convention that we also need to do another self-assessment and get another country review to perform. So we're barely halfway in the process.
Right.
And the fact that we haven't even touched the legislation, I mean, from 20, almost going on to 5 years and not much traction.
Right.
In
it's 4.5 going 5 years indeed. Similar to when we were getting ready to sign on to UNCAC, we had a committee with government and the social partners. We were a part of that committee. Do you think there should be a committee now with GOB and the social partners to oversee implementation? Would that be useful?
I actually think
definitely, it would definitely be useful for the short reason that on its own, I don't think the government has the motivation to do it. Because remember, at the end of the day, this process is essentially telling the political folks in our country that we'll be essentially handcuffing you to an extent. And so no politician wants to do that. Hence, if you don't have private sector and civil society involvement, the process will go nowhere. And going back to what Darrell said earlier, it takes countries years and years and years for that said reason.
Right. And I know it's intended, as you mentioned, to handcuff physically and metaphorically the politicians, but but it also is intended to stop the private sector from engaging in particular kinds of behavior with the public sector as well, because it's two. We always say two hands have to clap. It is not only government, but standards of behavior that extend into the private sector as well. How does the UN review mechanism work? You mentioned about the second review that needs to be done. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that is supposed to roll out?
Well, essentially, once we have initiated the changes to the legislation from the first round, in tandem, we're supposed to be then undergoing another gap assessment to determine what are the flaws when it comes to prevention and asset recovery. And it's the same process that it's a matter of time. And so we need to equip ourselves with the tools meaning the human resource to get behind the actual grinding out of legislation. And of course, the private sector and civil society involvement in ensuring that the process moves forward along the way.
Right. Darrell, how can civil society advocate for compliance on an ongoing basis?
Well, when you look at the treaty itself, and like most other treaties, there are these revision periods because the United Nations doesn't want to have you just sign a treaty. So there's certain benchmarks, and this is where the revision periods come in. So after 5 years, you should be doing this. After 10 years, you should be doing this. But I think very important point that was mentioned there is the issue of the political will. And I think that this is where the civil society and the private sector has the ultimate responsibility ensuring that there is the political will, that this remains on the radar as a national agenda item and that it does not move from government's focus. And I think that, like what Giacomo mentioned, that politicians will not want to regulate themselves. So it has to be a pluralistic approach, and it has to come from civil society and the private sector. And really and truly, you're talking about issues of governance. You're talking about inclusivity and how do we make the government work for the benefit of everyone in the society. The only thing that I would say in terms of what I don't agree with, what was mentioned, is that it's not really that you're handcuffing government, because government should not be about corruption. Government should be about good administration, public services, efficiency, and so forth. And I think that when we have more conversations about, and it comes back to this, what leadership is. I think a lot of people in Belize get elected to public office and they don't know what to do. And the easiest thing to do is to steal, because there's a lot of money there. I mean, I don't want to be negative, but the idea is, I think in tandem with working with Unkak is discussions at all levels about leadership, about what government is about, what government can do, what's an appropriate level of influence. Marissa mentioned this, and there is influence, but you have to recognize sometimes that influence peddling in government is actually a good thing. Because when you deal with influence peddling, if you are peddling influence in terms of ideological discussions and policy discussions, that's actually very positive. So that when you look at the United States, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the basis of that are all people who are trying to influence government.
But it's when you do it for private gain, that's when you get
it's positive, so that
yes.
in Belize, one of the things that I've always kind of like looked at is that there is not really any substantive discussion about where we want the government to go, like about vision and policies.
Right.
And that space is such a vacuum that space is overtaken by...
So let me ask you then, what role can the general public play? Because we're talking about civil society, the private sector, the labor unions, but you have a good set of people who would not be involved in either of those. What role can they play in ensuring compliance?
But this is a significant point, and then it goes back to, because when we were talking about this is beyond Unkak, and this is one of the things that I would really want to express, that we need the Unkak, but this is something that has to be organic, because it has to be something that is part of our political culture as Belizeans. And I think that a fundamental way that a citizen can be responsible in terms of compliance is how they vote. And you're talking about the idea of electoral reform, which is something that is not really touched in Unkak, but that's a big part of our problem in terms of political culture in Belize and the electoral process and the involvement of the citizen to make sure that they're voting for Unkak and reforms, because if they do that, then the politician would respond.
The only difficulty with that, Daryl, is that voting happens every 5 years, and in between we have to deal with the role of the voter as a citizen as the process is unfolding. Marissa or Giacomo, do you have any ideas on the involvement of ordinary persons, of the general public?
Well, you know, when we first started our lobbying towards having the UNCAC signed, we started with the general public. One of our campaigns was called Break the Corruption Chain, where we had bumper stickers, where we had prizes, giveaways. We did quite a bit of public advocacy towards
on the morning shows and that sort of thing.
Absolutely. We met directly with the Prime Minister, who, you know, former Prime Minister Dean Barrow, who also had sought a legal opinion from the Attorney General's Ministry about the implications and the needs for implementing UNCAC. So there was a lot of work that we did relating to the public to understand the key words of corruption, anti-corruption, and where the UNCAC is a part of that. Now, maybe what we're seeing 5 years down the line is that those hot topic words were so successful that it almost skewed people's understanding of the depth of what UNCAC really is, of the fact that UNCAC is a collection of jigsaw puzzle pieces that we have to put into place, and that not every legislation is going to use the word corruption or good governance, even though it might address matters of corruption and good governance. So for example, when you hear the chamber advocating for e-governance legislation, that is legislation towards good governance. Because if you implement e-governance legislation, it allows for processes, the government offering services online, using trackable, traceable methods so that you can know how your service is being handled, using online payment methods, allowing the government to accept payment methods online so that you're not handing cash to another human being who may be putting a part of that in their pocket or saying to you, you know that the $100 is supposed to cost, but if you give me 50, I will work it for you. You know, those are the sorts of things in everyday life that actually contribute to corruption and bad governance and bad fiscal management. And so there are several things that you can actually do that don't have those keyword, those hot topic words, but are actually effective when it comes to the fight against corruption.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the interesting things that that I've read is that the UNCAC, the Convention Against Corruption, does not actually have a definition of corruption in it.
Yeah.
Correct.
Because it's not definable in that way. It's in fact through the various laws that define what conduct is acceptable or not acceptable. And therefore, you will not find a definition of corruption in the Convention Against Corruption, which is an interesting, it's an interesting thing. Of course, people say, well, it's because you will never get people to agree on what corruption is in a word, and that is probably true too. But in fact, it's not about defining what the word means. It's about determining ethical behavior. It is about determining what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. But we're running out of time. So, Daryl, any final words on this topic for tonight?
Well, I wanted to end off with what Marissa was talking about, which is really this emphasis on performance. And I think that Unkak, and when you talk about anti-corruption, it's something that's negative, but you're really talking about something very, very positive, which is the improvement in governmental services and the performance of government for the benefit of national development.
Right.
And this is something that could unify the country if the government were to work with stakeholders like the private sector. And so the only point that I would want to emphasize that every single citizen has a role to play in understanding Unkak and lobbying for its implementation. Because it will mean a better country for all of us.
Marissa, any final words?
Well, I just want to say that UNCAC and its implementation overall, or just the implementation of a good governance system is just as important today as it was 5 years ago or so when it was being lobbied for. In fact, what we see now with a lot of issues of mistrust when we have these negotiations occurring between the government and the unions, lots of the questions that are coming up in this current impasse have to do with good governance measures as well. Have we audited the public sector? How do we know what we're paying to various staff members of the public sector? How do we know that the government isn't spending wildly, the new administration isn't spending wildly on assets that they don't really need? A lot of these questions could actually have been avoided if we took a very, very urgent and determined approach to anti-corruption measures over the last few years. Now, it's not too late. We know that this is going to be an ongoing process. We see some aspects coming into play. And we also, even as we see some of the attempts to pass some legislation on good governance, we equally use the UNCAC as a guide for checks and balances on some of those measures that we see coming about. We don't just take them at face value. We still have to be guided by international principles. And that's what we continue to do. So I think that, we're at a point in time where we still have to give respect where respect is due as it relates to what measures have been taken so far, because every step is a positive step as long as it follows what the true fundamental principles of the UNCAC and the anti-corruption movement really represents. But we need to, of course, start to see tangible results where we understand that there are consequences and the consequences are being felt by persons who choose to follow a certain lifestyle using their influence, using their position for illicit gain. We need to start to see actual penalization, and that I think will become the deterrent to other persons doing it. But for as long as it looks profitable and rewarding, it's going to be very difficult to tell anyone to stop the type of behavior they're engaging in.
Thanks, Marissa. Giacomo, final words?
Yes, and I think what we need in terms of next steps also is to for us to build back the momentum, one, and also continue agitating to ensure that there's a body that guides the process forward. Without that, I think we'll be we'll be having these discussions over and over, and to not much end. And so I think that is where we will see value for our money if we get back on track and start getting some legislation passed that will fill those gaps that were identified.
Thank you very much, Giacomo. Thank Marissa, thank you, Daryl, for being here tonight and engaging in this very in-depth conversation about the complexity of implementing Unkak. Thank you very much. We will now take our final break. Welcome back to the final segment of the conversation for tonight. Unkak has been tossed around in the public domain as a single-dose prescription to end corruption once and for all. Unfortunately, it is not that simple. Unkak is, as we have deeply analyzed tonight, a sprawling framework of legal instruments like the bones, muscles, and ligaments in our bodies to be transplanted into our legal system. While dissuading corruption in the public sector is the main concern of a growingly agonized society, the complete implementation of Unkak in Belize would set out to combat and respond to corruption and unethical practices in both the public and the private sectors. It would help us to level the playing field, reduce improper acquisition of public assets, unjust enrichment, bribery, and enabling asset recovery when corruption can be proven to have occurred. For us to see the day when Unkak is fully implemented in Belize, though, will require inspiring political will and an all-of-society oversight. One thing that I would personally like to see is an Unkak work program that sets out what we want to do in order of priority. It would help us in identifying resources needed for proper implementation, including law revision, training for investigators, prosecutors, and even judicial officers, and greater public education for citizens, civil society, and the media. If we are to enjoy a society with little to no corruption, all hands on deck will be required. Ambitious, yes. Impossible, not at all. We can do it. But with that, our time is up for tonight. Remember to join us on Mondays at 7 p.m. for new episodes of The Conversation right here on CBTV and on Colorblind's Facebook page. Good night and take care.